Dawn in Flaxborough was usually a courteous affair. The river mist lifted at a mannerly pace, the shop blinds rose in orderly sequence, and the ducks, mindful of appearances, seldom quacked with undue enthusiasm before 8. Thus, when a narrow boat no one recognized slid silently past the town landing stage at 5:30 in the morning, it disrupted not the peace so much as the schedule, and this, to the people of Flaxborough, was quite unforgivable. The vessel in question was long, dark-hulled, and embellished with a flamboyance entirely unbecoming to the sedate River Flax. Its name, painted in curling gold at the prow, proclaimed it the Gypsy Queen. Along the cabin sides hung strings of coloured charms and glossy feathers, some of which trembled in the thin breeze as though embarrassed by their own finery. No one appeared at its tiller, no engine murmured. It came on as though drawn by some faint, private intention of its own. Unfortunately for the town's dignity, the first person to notice its arrival was Mr. Hubble, a stout man whose emotional core resided in his attachment to the local population of swans. Mr. Hubble was at that hour fussing on the river-bank, lamenting the ungrateful behaviour of a particularly belligerent cob, when the Gypsy Queen floated toward him with a serenity quite at odds with the morning's avian outbursts. The boat's bow nudged the bank and startled the swan into a display of hissing misapprehension that Mr. Hubble would later recount to everyone as a life-threatening onslaught. No second witness was present to correct him. By the time the sun had risen, the presence of the boat had become the chief concern of the Flaxborough Regatta Committee, who were meeting in the assembly rooms to discuss this year's arrangements. The regatta was in theory a sporting event. In practice, it was an excuse for the council to remind the public of its existence. The intrusion of an unregistered vessel into their domain was therefore taken as a personal affront. Mrs. Pond, the committee chairwoman and wearer of unusually rigid hats, announced with characteristic firmness that some kinds of people had been encroaching on the waterways of late. Councillor Oxby seconded her disapproval, though he admitted rather sheepishly that the boat did appear clean, well-maintained, and alarmingly tasteful compared to most local craft. The others murmured gravely, as though confronted with a moral paradox. Meanwhile, on the river-bank, Police Constable Love stood, with his hands on his hips, gazing at the Gypsy Queen as if expecting it to confess something. Love was a good-natured man, but possessed of an expression that suggested permanent bafflement at the workings of the human world. He surveyed the deck through narrowed eyes. "No sign of anybody aboard, sir," he reported when Inspector Purbright joined him a few minutes later. Purbright, as usual, arrived without drama. He walked with his customary amble, as though his feet were content simply to accompany his thoughts wherever they drifted. He regarded the mysterious boat with mild interest. A lesser man might have frowned or stroked his chin. Purbright only folded his hands politely behind his back. "Quite a decorative arrival," he observed. Love nodded. "Mr. Hubble says he saw a woman on board at around 4 this morning, wearing a red shawl, told him she was going upriver." "Ah?" Purbright's tone held neither surprise nor scepticism, merely the gentle invitation for Love to continue. "Well, sir, she's not there now." "No," Purbright agreed. "It seems she is not." Love took this as encouragement to pursue deeper speculation. "Could be someone fell overboard," he offered. "Or perhaps ran off." Purbright looked at the boat again. The cabin door stood slightly ajar. A few bright feathers hung limp against the painted wood. Something about the arrangement was, not disorderly, but unfinal. He tapped a finger lightly against his palm. "I should prefer," he said softly, "not to assume either just yet." At that moment, The regatta committee, having declared itself both disrupted and morally offended, descended upon the riverbank in a cluster of officious indignation. Mrs. Pond's hat wobbled with the intensity of her distress. "Inspector," she declared, before Purbright could greet her, "this vessel must be removed. It is inviting an element we do not encourage in Flaxborough." "Which element is that, madam?" asked Purbright, with courteous curiosity. Mrs. Pond hesitated, then settled on, "An unsupervised one." Purbright nodded as though this were a well-established category of civic threat. "We shall, of course, make inquiries," he said. Mrs. Pond appeared mollified enough to retreat to the assembly rooms and attempt to reassert her dominion over the regatta's logistical woes. Once she was gone, Purbright stepped lightly onto the narrow boat's deck, his weight scarcely disturbing its balance. Love followed with a caution that suggested he expected the boat might bite. Together they examined the small space. Nothing appeared amiss. Nothing shouted alarm. Yet everything felt strangely paused. Purbright glanced toward the half-open cabin door. The air inside smelled faintly of spices, and most curiously of smoke that was not from the river mist. "A visitor," he murmured, "who may or may not have wished to be noticed." Love opened his mouth to ask for clarification, but Purbright was already stepping back onto the bank. "Let us begin," the inspector said with his characteristic gentle finality, "by discovering who expected her." By mid-morning, the Gypsy Queen had become less a vessel and more a conversational weather system drifting through Flaxborough. Wherever two or more residents stood together, outside the bakery, near the post office, in the chemist's slow-moving queue, the topic inevitably swung back to the unmanned boat and the mysterious woman reportedly seen aboard it. The accuracy of the descriptions, however, degraded at a rate only small towns could achieve. The woman's shawl, once simply red, became crimson, then scarlet, then, according to an excitable Mrs. Tuffet, so blood-coloured you'd think she'd come straight from a murder. Someone else insisted it was orange. Another claimed she saw gold threads. None of these people had in fact glimpsed the woman, a technicality that hindered them not at all. Purbright listened to these fragmenting descriptions with the same expression he used when contemplating the weather, politely attentive, mildly diverted, offering nothing in return. He and Love stood near the landing stage, speaking to a narrow-faced boatman who had taken it upon himself to serve as unofficial harbour authority. "Didn't see her myself," the boatman admitted, leaning on a mooring post. "But Ted Plover swears blind he did. Says she moved like someone used to balancing on water, whatever that means." "Did Mr. Plover describe her face?" Purbright asked. "He said she had one," the man replied, scratching his ear. "That was the extent of his commitment." Purbright thanked him with a nod. Love was already scribbling into his notebook with the uncertain air of someone aware that most of what he was writing would later prove irrelevant. The two men boarded the Gypsy Queen again to resume their inspection. The thin smell of spice lingered in the air, faint but distinctive. Love located the source, a small tin of Hungarian paprika that lay on its side near the cabin doorway, red powder dusting the wooden floor in a thin crescent. It looked neither spilled by accident nor arranged with purpose, merely something interrupted. "Odd thing for a traveller to carry," Love observed. "Not British paprika either." "No," Purbright agreed lightly. "Not British." He crouched beside the spill, observing its shape without touching it. The crescent had a curious asymmetry, as though the tin had been nudged and then steadied before falling completely to its side. Not intentional, not quite careless. He filed the impression away. Inside the cabin they found little: a neatly folded blanket, a cracked but clean teacup, and a small brass charm shaped like a sunburst. Purbright held the charm to the light. It was well made, with a sheen that suggested it had been touched frequently. "Looks foreign," Love said. "Looks loved," Purbright murmured. They stepped back outside as a new crowd assembled on the riverbank. This one consisting largely of those who resented being left out of the earlier gossip. Young Mr. Fairling, the stationer's assistant, announced loudly that the mysterious woman must have been a clairvoyant. He offered this with the authority of someone who had once visited a seaside fortune-telling booth. Mrs. Pond, drifting back toward the scene as though drawn by her own dread of unregulated events, overheard and dismissed the clairvoyant theory at once. "Nonsense," she said briskly. If she were a clairvoyant, she would have anticipated the trouble and avoided it. This remark caused a small ripple of agreement among her followers, who appreciated an argument that removed the need for any further thought. Purbright, still observing the crowd, asked mildly, "Has anyone actually spoken to the woman?" No one had. Nor, it became increasingly clear, had anyone made any effort to do so while she was allegedly aboard. Flaxborough was not a town soothed by novelty. It preferred its surprises to remain theoretical. Love cleared his throat as he approached Purbright. "Sir, the committee wants to know if we've identified her yet." "Have we?" Purbright asked pleasantly. "No, sir." "Then perhaps we should resist the temptation to say that we have." Love nodded, faintly chastened. To move matters along, if only to spare Flaxborough from consuming itself through speculation, Purbright and Love walked to the riverside cottages nearest the mooring. The first door to open belonged to a Mr. Crampton, a gaunt man whose interest in the world appeared limited to the movements of his 3 cats. He had not seen the woman in the red shawl, nor had he noticed the boat until it bumped the bank. "I don't look at boats," he said flatly. "They never look back." The next resident, a retired hairdresser named Miss Murgatroyd, was more forthcoming. She insisted she had seen a sinuous lady boarding the Gypsy Queen around midnight. Her description, however, was complicated by the quantity of gin that had gone into her evening tea. "Terribly glamorous creature," she said. "Floaty hair, or possibly a hat. Something floaty at any rate." Purbright thanked her with sincere politeness, though his eyes suggested he would not be pursuing the matter of the floatiness further. It was only at the 3rd cottage, belonging to Mrs. Birkett, the self-appointed guardian of all activity visible from her kitchen window, that they found something resembling a coherent account. She had not only seen the boat in the night, but had witnessed, or so she insisted, the shawled woman conversing with a tall man on the towpath. "He had a dreadful stoop," she added importantly. "Looked like the sort that keeps secrets. You can always tell." Purbright regarded her with mild interest. "And what were they discussing?" "Oh, I couldn't hear," Mrs. Birkett admitted, not at all troubled by this limitation. But she was gesturing, quite heatedly, pointing at the boat as though asking him to leave or stay. "I'm not entirely sure which." "And then?" Purbright prompted. "And then she went aboard. He left. That was at least 3 hours before the boat drifted into town." This was the first remark that gave Purbright pause. He repeated the details silently. "Before the boat drifted into town." Mrs. Birkett, pleased with her own thoroughness, leaned in confidentially. "I'd say she's in trouble, Inspector, the dramatic kind." Purbright's eyes narrowed only slightly, not in suspicion but in thought. "Thank you, Mrs. Birkett. You have been most observant." He and Love stepped away from the cottage, the river murmuring softly beside them. The morning light had grown stronger, warming the colours on the boat's painted trim. The paprika stain remained like an unfinished sentence across the deck. "She boarded the boat," Love said, "and then vanished." Purbright replied. "Or perhaps she simply stopped being observed." Love frowned, unsure what distinction was being made. Purbright began walking toward the station, hands folded calmly behind him. "Constable, let us not worry yet about where she went. First, we shall concern ourselves with why she arrived." The Gypsy Queen rocked gently at its mooring, as though in agreement. Mrs. Birkett awoke the following morning with the gratifying sense that she was, once again, the most essential person in Flaxborough. It was not often that her talents, vigilance, suspicion, and the uncanny ability to draw conclusions from insufficient data were given room to flourish. But the arrival of the Gypsy Queen had provided precisely the sort of stimulus she felt the town had long needed. And so, fortified by a pot of overstrong tea and an inflated sense of civic purpose, she positioned herself at the kitchen window to begin her daily scrutiny of the riverbank. Her breakfast plate waited beside her, neglected but virtuous in its arrangement. One slice of toast, half a grapefruit, and an egg she had already condemned as listless. She rarely ate quickly. Food, in her view, should never distract from more important matters, especially when the world outside insisted on behaving suspiciously. This morning, however, she did not have to wait long for something to justify her watchfulness. At a little after 7, she noticed a figure walking along the towpath, a man she did not recognize, which immediately made him worthy of interest. He was tall and thin, with the hunched posture of someone who lived under the pressure of private worries. He paused near the Gypsy Queen, looked around with furtive exaggeration, and then did something that caused Mrs. Birkett to drop her fork entirely. He threw something into the river. The object was small, dark, metallic, she thought, and it sank too quickly for her to see clearly. But his gesture was unmistakably deliberate. She gasped in satisfaction. This, she thought, was precisely the sort of behavior she had always warned people about. She watched him leave, striding away with the energy of someone wishing to appear unhurried. She made a mental note to mention him at the earliest possible opportunity, which, as fate would have it, turned out to be barely an hour later when Inspector Purbright and Constable Love knocked on her door, seeking clarification about her account of the woman in the red shawl. "Inspector!" she exclaimed, ushering them inside with the grandeur of a hostess welcoming royalty. "You've come at exactly the right moment. Something dreadful has occurred, and I alone have witnessed it." Purbright, who had been expecting precisely this tone, inclined his head politely. "We are always grateful for your assistance, Mrs. Birkett." She wasted no time recounting her morning's observation, embellishing only in the sense of personal danger she felt while watching the man. Love scribbled dutifully, though his expression wavered somewhere between intrigue and mild disbelief. "And you are certain," Purbright asked gently once she finished, "that you had not seen this man before?" "I never forget a face," she said with pride, "especially one engaged in wrongdoing." Purbright nodded slowly. His eyes wandered to the mantelpiece, where a large grandfather clock ticked loudly enough to rival her own narration. It was elaborately carved, but currently in some distress. Its pendulum swung at an uneven pace, and it emitted a faint, irregular click. "That clock," he said lightly, "is running a few minutes slow." Mrs. Birkett sniffed. "It's sentimental. It belonged to my late husband." Purbright examined it only a second longer, but something about its state, like an intention interrupted, seemed to settle into his thoughts. He did not comment further. "Now," he continued, "this man you saw, did he appear familiar in any other way? His clothing, his walk, his manner?" She paused, considering. "His shoes were muddy." Love blinked. "Muddy, madam?" "Very muddy," she insisted. "Not respectable mud, either. Wild mud." Purbright's lips moved in what might, in another man, have been the shadow of a smile. I see." He thanked her once more, and when she attempted to add yet another speculation about the shawled woman's intentions, he gracefully folded the conversation closed by promising that all information would be given its appropriate weight. Outside, Love exhaled as though he had been holding his breath out of courtesy. "Sir," he said carefully, "do you think she actually saw someone throw something in?" "Oh, yes," Purbright replied. "Mrs. Birkett is many things, but unobservant is not one of them." Love brightened. "Then we should drag the river." Purbright cast him a sidelong glance of gentle amusement. "Love, the flax is barely deep enough for the riverbed to hide from itself. If something was thrown in, we shall likely find it without enlisting divers." They walked the short distance back to the landing stage. The morning sun scattered thin gold across the water, illuminating eddies and exposing every discarded scrap along the shallow bottom near the bank. Purbright peered down with interest. "A man of such discretion," he said softly, "is unlikely to choose a hiding place so public." "Maybe he panicked, sir," Love suggested. "Possibly." But Purbright's tone had shifted, just slightly, into the realm of ideas not yet spoken aloud. He directed Love to search the water near the point Mrs. Birkett indicated. Within a few minutes, Love let out a triumphant noise and retrieved a small, dark, metallic object from the riverbed. He handed it to Purbright, somewhat proud of the mud now decorating his trouser leg. Purbright turned the object over in his fingers. It was a padlock, old, rusted at the edges, and broken cleanly across the shank. Not recently snapped, but not long discarded either. "Well," Love said eagerly, "this must prove someone was up to no good." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. "Or perhaps it proves that someone wished us to think so." Love frowned at this, uncertain. Purbright slipped the broken padlock into an evidence envelope, though his manner suggested it was no ordinary piece of scrap metal. He gazed toward the Gypsy Queen once more, noting the way it sat utterly still, as though holding its breath. "Sir?" Love asked. Purbright's voice remained perfectly mild. "Constable, when people throw things away, they generally hope they won't be found. When people throw things away in front of an audience, one must ask what performance they intended." Love looked genuinely perplexed. "An audience, sir?" Purbright nodded toward Mrs. Birkett's cottage window, where a curtain twitched with guilty enthusiasm. "Some spectators," he said, "require no invitation." He began walking toward the station again, hands clasped behind him, steps slow and thoughtful. "Let us continue," he said quietly. "The river has begun telling its story. We must listen for the next sentence." By late afternoon, the riverbank, having served its morning purpose as a magnet for rumour, surrendered its dominance to the next natural authority in Flaxborough, the town council. News of the broken padlock, exaggerated through several cycles of repetition, had reached them with all the solemn weight of a national crisis. The council, already unsettled by the uninvited arrival of the Gypsy Queen, decided that something had to be done, and more importantly, someone had to be blamed. Inspector Purbright and Constable Love were summoned to the assembly rooms where the council members sat in a loose semicircle of righteous unease. Mrs. Pond, crowned once more with her uncompromising hat, presided with the air of a battlefield surgeon preparing to amputate dignity from the situation. "Inspector," she began without greeting, "we have determined that recent disturbances must be attributed to shortcomings in river oversight. This matter cannot go unaddressed." Purbright, who had never seen the river display shortcomings except in depth, waited politely. Councillor Oxby cleared his throat. "We feel it appropriate that the responsibility lies with Mr. Olwyn. Pike! He is, after all, our most prominent boating licence holder." A murmur of agreement travelled the room, relieved agreement, the kind that prefers a convenient conclusion to a truthful one. Purbright offered a mild smile. "Mr. Pike, if I recall, owns a number of pleasure craft." "And leases half the moorings," Mrs. Pond added. "He has a duty to maintain order among the boating population." Purbright nodded. "Has Mr. Pike allowed any of the boats currently moored to be used without permission?" "We cannot say," Mrs. Pond admitted briskly, "but it seems very likely." Love shifted uncomfortably. "Likely in what way, ma'am?" "In the way that supports the needs of this investigation," she replied. At that moment the doors opened, and Mr. Olwyn Pike entered, summoned, or, depending on one's perspective, ambushed by the council. He was a man built for handshakes, sleek, confident, and so self-assured that even his jacket seemed tailored from charm. He smiled broadly upon seeing Purbright. "Inspector and Constable Love, terribly sorry to hear about all this trouble." He gestured toward the councillors as though sharing a private joke about their fussiness. "I've been told you wish to speak with me." Purbright inclined his head. "The council has expressed concern that the arrival of an unregistered vessel may relate to your moorings." Pike gave a theatrical sigh, more amused than troubled. "Ah, bureaucracy in distress. I understand completely." He faced the councillors with a reassuring smile. "I keep meticulous records, as you all know. Nothing happens at my moorings without my knowledge." Mrs. Pond stiffened, but said nothing. Purbright regarded Pike with polite neutrality. "Mr. Pike, have you noticed anyone unfamiliar making use of the river recently?" Pike pressed a hand to his chest. "Inspector, unfamiliar people are a constant feature of rivers. They drift through, they vanish. That is the romance of boating." "It is not the romance of Flaxborough," Mrs. Pond muttered. Ignoring this, Pike turned his charm directly toward Purbright. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, I'll assist. We must keep the regatta respectable." Purbright's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Indeed." After a few more inconclusive statements, Pike being generous and the councillors being vaguely punitive, the meeting dissolved in a cloud of gratitude and suspicion. Pike offered Purbright a handshake so warm it might have been intended to melt metal. Outside the assembly rooms, Love let out a low whistle. "He's a smooth one, sir." "A practised gentleman," Purbright corrected mildly. "There is a difference." "Well, do you think he could be involved?" Love asked. "With the boat or the woman?" Purbright made no immediate reply. Instead, he began walking toward Pike's boatyard, which sat just beyond the bend of the river. Love followed. The yard was neat, perhaps excessively so. Chains coiled with geometric precision, life vests hung in symmetrical rows, and the office window gleamed with the sort of polish usually reserved for respectable shoes. The smell of varnish hovered over everything. A young attendant emerged and informed them that Mr. Pike had gone to attend important matters. Hearing this, Purbright's gaze wandered to a shed near the back of the yard, its door slightly ajar. The attendant stiffened. "Sir, that's storage. Best not to go in. Not safe." Purbright approached it anyway, his steps unhurried. Inside, he found a cluster of boating equipment, oars, mats, coils of rope, and a fabric bundle lying near a crate. He touched it lightly with one finger. It was a shawl, red, but not the one described by Mrs. Birkett. This one was richer, heavier, a deeper shade. It bore no fringe, no pattern, a different garment entirely. "Sir," Love whispered, that's odd." Purbright replied. He examined the shawl's texture, noting faint traces of perfume, nothing exotic, simply something floral and familiar. Carefully, he folded it and set it back where he found it. Outside, the attendant was sweating. "Mr. Pike keeps that shed locked," he stammered. "Mostly?" Purbright nodded. "Mostly," he echoed. They stepped back into the sunlight. The river shimmered, but its easy brightness no longer felt quite honest. Love looked at Purbright eagerly. "Is it hers, sir? The woman's?" Purbright shook his head. "No, but it is someone's." They walked slowly toward the station, the weight of the shawl's meaning following them like a silent spectator. "You see, love," Purbright said quietly. "The council wishes to believe this incident simple, Mr. Pike wishes to appear helpful, and the river wishes to tell us something we have not yet listened for." Love waited. Purbright continued, "Until we know who this second shawl belongs to, we cannot assume the first belonged to the woman at all." Love blinked. "So, she might not be who everyone says?" "That," Purbright murmured, "is the danger of borrowed garments." They moved on, the river murmuring behind them, the air thick with secrets, and the faint perfume of a mislaid shawl lingering in Purbright's thoughts. The discovery of the second shawl lingered in Purbright's thoughts long after he and Love left Pike's boatyard. It was not merely its presence that unsettled him, but the quiet confidence with which Pike had assumed the council would place their faith and their blame upon him. A man too eager to be trusted was, in Purbright's experience, rarely without reason to fear being examined. Yet he said nothing about this directly as they returned to the station. Instead, he asked Love to fetch the old river incident logs, a stack of dusty-bound volumes that chronicled decades of minor disputes and modest scandals along the Flax. Love carried them with the reverence of someone holding sacred texts, though the volumes were held together more by stubbornness than by binding. Purbright leafed through them slowly, his fingers brushing the yellowed pages with deliberate gentleness. The morning sunlight caught faint motes of dust rising from the books, like tiny ghosts stirred awake. "Sir," Love said, hovering, "are you expecting something particular?" "Not expecting," Purbright murmured, "merely listening." Love waited, accustomed by now to such cryptic remarks. Then halfway through a volume dated some 15 years earlier, Purbright stopped. A small notation near the end of the ledger drew his attention, a brief report of a petty theft along the canal involving a travelling performer accused of stealing jewellery from a riverside caravan. The complainant's statement described the suspect as a woman in a red shawl, foreign in appearance, quick of movement, and uncooperative with proper English discipline. Love, reading over his shoulder, whispered, "Another woman with a red shawl." Purbright gave the faintest nod. "It seems the colour has a history here." The report continued. The woman was never found, the jewellery was later recovered under circumstances unclear, and the matter had faded into indifference when no claimant came forward to reclaim the items. A small-town crime, brief, quietly embarrassing, and quickly dismissed. "Do you think it could be the same woman, sir?" Love asked. "Unlikely," Purbright answered, "but it may be the same story." Love frowned. "I don't follow." "Stories," Purbright said gently, closing the ledger, "have a curious way of repeating themselves when the town wishes them to. Memory is not a record, Love. It is an heirloom, polished and passed down until it resembles something quite different from what occurred." Love considered this, eventually deciding it might be true. They set the ledger aside and returned to the Gypsy Queen, now resting more obediently at the mooring. A soft breeze stirred the feathers along its trim. Purbright stepped aboard once more, not searching exactly but sensing. The interior remained unchanged, the blanket neatly folded, the teacups still waiting for a drinker who had not returned, the scent of paprika faint but persistent. "What if?" Love ventured. The woman never meant to leave. What if someone took her? Purbright tilted his head. A possibility, but taken where? A river leaves fewer hiding places than most landscapes. Then why did she vanish? Purbright let his gaze drift across the water. Perhaps because someone wished her to appear missing, rather than simply absent. He turned back to the cabin and examined a small metal hook beside the doorframe. It was empty, but the slight indentation in the wood suggested something had hung there recently. Something with weight, but not bulk. A bag, perhaps, or a shawl. A shawl. But whose? He stepped out onto the deck and surveyed the bank. Mrs. Burkitt's window glinted accusingly. The river slid past with its usual air of detached innocence. Love, watching Purbright think, said carefully, "Sir, do you think Mr. Pike could be involved with the woman, or the padlock?" "Mr. Pike," Purbright replied, "is involved with something, certainly. The question is whether that something is connected to this boat." Love sighed. "This is getting tangled." "Human behavior often is," Purbright agreed. "But water tends to untangle things. It carries what people wish to hide until the current grows tired of keeping secrets." As they walked back toward town, Purbright slowed near a bench by the towpath. An elderly man sat there, feeding crumbs to the ducks with the serene air of someone who had noticed far more of life than he discussed. Purbright recognized him, Mr. Gilby, retired librarian, possessor of a memory sharp enough to slice paper. "Good afternoon, Mr. Gilby," Purbright said pleasantly. Gilby smiled without looking up. "Inspector, trouble on the river again?" "An unfamiliar boat," Purbright confirmed. "Aye," Gilby nodded. "Reminds me of the old days. Travelling folk used to come through often. Acrobats, musicians, tricksters, the one they called the Queen. She had a barge as pretty as a painting, always wore bright colours, said she couldn't abide grey." Purbright exchanged a look with Love. "A queen?" he asked gently. "Oh yes," Gilby said, tossing another crumb. "Some called her the Gypsy Queen, not for any ancestry, just her manner, came and went as she pleased, had a way of stirring people up without meaning to." "Was she involved in any incidents?" Purbright asked. Gilby's smile faded into something more thoughtful. "There was a fuss once, some jewellery gone missing, I think. People blamed her because she was different, as if difference were a crime, nothing ever proven." Purbright leaned slightly forward. "Did she ever come back?" Gilby shook his head. "Not after that business. Folks whispered too much. She said whispers were heavier than anchors." Love swallowed. The breeze ruffled the feathers on the Gypsy Queen as though echoing the words. Purbright gave a slow nod of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Gilby. You've been very helpful." As they walked away, Love murmured, "Sir, you think someone's repeating that old story?" Purbright's eyes narrowed with quiet clarity. "No, Love. I think someone fears that it might return." They moved on, the memory of the long-vanished queen drifting after them like perfume on the river air, a reminder that past and present were rarely as separate as the town pretended. By the next morning, Flaxborough had almost convinced itself that matters on the river were settling down. The council, having unburdened its anxieties upon Mr. Pike and considered the crisis suitably delegated, resumed its habit of not thinking too hard. Mrs. Burkitt, having described her sighting of the mysterious man 6 separate times to 6 increasingly fatigued listeners, finally permitted herself a brief rest. Even the swans appeared to relax. The river, however, was not finished speaking. Purbright and Love were on their way to revisit the Gypsy Queen when a shout echoed from further down the towpath, sharp enough to slice through the morning calm. It came from a fisherman, a wiry man in a wool cap, who was waving both arms as though signalling to passing aircraft. Purbright adjusted his pace, though still without haste, and arrived beside the distressed fisherman just as another boat drifted into view around the bend. It was smaller than the Gypsy Queen, a narrow boat of dull green paint and practical design, the kind used for hauling supplies rather than impressing tourists. No one piloted it. Its cabin door hung open, rocking gently with the river's motion. A rope, still attached to one of its cleats, suggested it had been recently moored, yet no mooring post claimed it. The fisherman wiped his brow. "Didn't come from upriver," he muttered. "I know every vessel up there. This one came from nowhere." Love peered inside. "No one aboard, sir?" Purbright stepped lightly onto the deck, his expression unreadable. The interior was sparse, a small bunk, a wooden crate, an empty lantern hook, a scattering of straw. On the crate lay a torn page of paper fluttering in the breeze. He lifted it carefully. The page appeared to be from a diary or notebook, written in a looping hand. Only a fragment remained, torn from its binding. "Queen, must not know. Ledger, before the river carries it." The rest was lost to the tear. Love leaned in too closely and read upside down. "It's talking about the Queen, sir. That must mean the Gypsy Queen or the woman." "Or neither," Purbright said softly. "Words tend to wander from their meanings when removed from their homes." He examined the torn edge thoughtfully. The paper was thick, fibrous, and not recently damaged. It had been ripped with purpose, though not with care. The fisherman cleared his throat uneasily. "Inspector, there's talk. People say someone's been signalling from the reeds at night, a lantern flickering, like someone calling for help." Love straightened. "Who reported that?" "Only old Harry, the eel catcher," the man admitted. "But he's got good eyes. Terrible judgment, but good eyes." Purbright considered this, then stepped back onto the bank. The river's current carried the abandoned boat forward with a languid determination, as though delivering a message at its own pace. He watched it for a long moment. "Constable," he said, "follow the current and see where it intends to leave this vessel. I suspect it will choose somewhere inconvenient." Love hurried off, eager for physical work, leaving Purbright with the fisherman. "Have you seen this boat before?" Purbright asked. The man shook his head emphatically. "No, sir, and I don't like it. First that fancy thing yesterday, now this, it's too much movement. The river's up to tricks." Purbright thanked him with a nod, then walked along the bank, following the slow drift of the new arrival. His mind caught and released possibilities like birds hopping along a rail. The diary fragment nagged at him, not its words, but its purpose. Someone wished something not to be known, and someone else wanted something found. The broken padlock, the second shawl, the vanished woman, the sudden arrival of a new, unclaimed boat. None of it formed a pattern yet, but the picture seemed intent on drawing itself. Love reappeared moments later, panting. "Sir!" It grounded near the old reed beds, just nudged itself in like it meant to hide. Purbright nodded. "Let us see." They reached the reed beds, a quiet stretch of marshy bank rarely visited, except by herons and fishermen, too unfriendly for company. The boat rested there, half veiled by tall reeds that swayed like eavesdroppers avoiding suspicion. Purbright examined the bank. Mud bore the imprint of boots, not fresh, but recent enough. One set larger, one smaller, both leading away from the water, then vanishing into firmer ground where prints could no longer be trusted. Love followed his gaze. "Two people, sir, coming from the boat?" "Or going to it," Purbright murmured. He stepped back, scanning the river as though expecting it to offer commentary. The breeze carried the faint smell of smoke. Wood smoke, not river mist. Perhaps from someone's breakfast fire. Perhaps not. "Sir," Love said suddenly, "what if this second boat is connected to that old case, the jewellery theft?" "All things are connected to old cases," Purbright said gently, "especially in Flaxborough, where history tends to accumulate in corners." He opened the crate on the boat. Empty. But the wood inside bore faint impressions, as if something rectangular and heavy had once been stored there, like a ledger. He closed the crate. Love exhaled. "Someone's trying to hide something, aren't they?" "Or draw attention away from something else," Purbright said. They began walking back toward town, following a narrow path beside the reeds. The fisherman's earlier words returned, someone signalling at night. "Love," Purbright said after a moment. "Ask Mr. Gilby whether he still has any records of itinerant performers, posters, notices, anything preserved by accident." "Old posters, sir?" "People often forget what they used to remember," Purbright replied. "Paper seldom does." As they neared the mooring where the Gypsy Queen sat, a council messenger ran toward them, waving frantically. "Inspector, the committee demands your presence at once." Purbright gave a courteous nod. "And what moves the council to such urgency today?" "The second boat, sir. Everyone's saying, 'It's a sign. Something's terribly wrong on the river.'" Purbright exchanged a look with Love, a quiet, resigned amusement. Flaxborough had decided it was time to panic. He followed the messenger without hesitation. Love trotted beside him, whispering, "Sir, things are escalating." "Indeed," Purbright said softly. "The river is raising its voice." They walked on, the current whispering behind them, carrying secrets from one boat to another, as though weaving a story no one yet wished to tell. The council's emergency gathering proved, as such things usually did, to be more noise than substance. By the time Purbright and Love arrived, half the members were already speaking at once, as though volume alone might compel the river to confess its mischief. Mrs. Pond, pale with indignation, presided over the tumult like a conductor whose orchestra had staged a rebellion. "Inspector," she demanded the moment he stepped through the door, "how many boats are we to expect drifting into town uninvited? We require assurance." Purbright inclined his head politely. "I shall provide what assurance the facts allow, madam." This proved deeply unsatisfying to several councillors, who preferred the kind of assurance that required no further thinking. Still, after several minutes of posturing, the group disbanded, leaving Purbright with little more than a headache and a renewed appreciation for silence. When they stepped outside into the fresher air, Love exhaled dramatically. "Sir, I think the town's going into hysterics." Purbright gave a small, sympathetic nod. Fear often flourishes where knowledge is absent. They walked toward the station, but Purbright slowed as they passed Pike's boatyard. Something in the river breeze seemed to nudge his attention toward it. Without explaining himself, he turned down the path and approached the wooden office where Pike liked to cultivate the impression of industriousness. The door was unlocked. Pike was not inside. Love looked uneasy. "Sir, should we wait for him?" Purbright, already inside, studied the room with mild interest. There were framed photographs of Pike shaking hands with various town officials, certificates proclaiming excellence in river safety, and a large map of the Flaxborough waterways. Everything was tidy, too tidy in fact, the sort of deliberate order created by someone who wished their life to appear simpler than it was. On the desk stood a boxy metal safe, old-fashioned but sturdy. Next to it lay a small brass key on a ribbon. Purbright picked up the key, tested its weight, and then, without a word, slid it into the lock of a narrow drawer beneath the desk. The drawer opened smoothly. Inside was a ledger. It was thick, bound in faded green cloth, its corners softened by long use. The pages were edged with the faint shadow of constant handling. Purbright lifted it with both hands, almost reverently, and set it on the desk. Love watched, spellbound. "Is that—" "His accounts?" Love whispered. "Accounts of a kind," Purbright replied. He opened it. The handwriting was precise, small and tightly packed. Each entry appeared coded in simple but consistent shorthand, initials, numbers, small annotations in the margin. Not incriminating, at least not obviously so. But on the last few pages the entries shifted, more erratic writing, hurriedly scribbled symbols, and occasional smudges. "Sir," Love said, "this doesn't look like bookkeeping." "No," Purbright agreed softly. "It looks like remembering." He turned one more page. The next sheet was missing, torn out carefully, leaving only a thin row of paper fibers. Purbright touched the torn edge. "The diary page from the second boat," he murmured. "The thickness of the paper, the fiber, it matches this." Love leaned closer. "So the page came from this ledger? But why would Pike tear it out?" "Perhaps he did not," Purbright said, closing the book. "Or perhaps he did, but not recently." He replaced the ledger in the drawer, locked it, and returned the key to its place. Nothing in his movement suggested intrusion. Instead, he handled everything with the quiet respect of someone tidying a bookshelf in a library. They left the office just as Pike came briskly across the yard, waving as though they'd arrived to admire his enterprise. "Inspector, Constable, always a pleasure. I've just been arranging things for the regatta. Busy days, you know." Purbright returned the wave with courteous modesty. "Indeed, Mr. Pike. Your involvement is clearly extensive." "Well," Pike said, flattered, "I do try to keep the river running smoothly." Purbright regarded him with a look that was neither accusatory nor trusting, merely patient. "We found another boat this morning." Pike's expression froze for the faintest instant, then brightened artificially. "Ah, yes, rumours spread fast. Terrible business. Must be vandals or outsiders. The river attracts all sorts." "Does it attract you, Mr. Pike?" Purbright asked gently. Pike blinked. "Me?" "You seem unusually invested," Purbright continued, his tone mild, "and unusually concerned." Pike laughed nervously. "Well, of course I'm concerned. My reputation is tied to these waters." "The river," Purbright said pleasantly, "tends to resist ownership." Pike excused himself moments later with a flurry of obligations. When he had gone, Love exhaled. "He looked rattled, sir." "Most people do," Purbright said softly, "when their past begins knocking." They continued along the path, leaving the boatyard behind. The river widened here, the reeds whispering softly with every shift of wind. Purbright paused near the water's edge and looked down. The reflection of the Gypsy Queen shimmered on the surface, a wavering image, peaceful only at a distance. "Sir," Love said suddenly, "if the ledger page came from Pike's drawer, that means someone must have taken it." "Indeed? But why put it on another boat? Why tear out only one page?" Purbright clasped his hands behind him. "Because, Love, sometimes the most effective way to hide a truth is to reveal only part of it, preferably in a confusing location." Love frowned. "Who would do that?" "Someone who wishes to be heard," Purbright replied, "but fears speaking plainly." They resumed walking, travelling upriver toward town. A few paces ahead, the old librarian, Mr. Gilby, waved from his usual bench. He held a rolled poster, faded, torn, and carefully preserved. Purbright greeted him with a nod and sat beside him. Gilby offered the poster. "Found this after you left yesterday. Thought you might want to look." Purbright unrolled it delicately. The colours were dim with age, the lettering ornate. It advertised a travelling troupe of canal performers. At the centre stood a woman in bold costume, draped in a shawl, not red, but brilliantly patterned, with the title beneath, the Gypsy Queen, Enchantress of the Waterways. Love stared. "Sir, she looks nothing like the woman described by Mrs. Birkett." "No," Purbright murmured, "but she looks very much like someone the town would remember incorrectly." Gilby tapped the poster. "People blamed her for things she never did. She left quietly, but not without sorrow." Purbright folded the poster and returned it with gratitude. As he rose, he said softly, "The river forgets slowly. People even slower." He and Love walked on, the whisper of the reeds trailing behind them like a memory stirring awake, quiet, persistent, and waiting for the next revelation. The discovery of the old performer's poster continued to linger in Purbright's thoughts as he and Love made their return toward town. The breeze off the river stirred gently at their coats as though encouraging them onward, teasing them with half-truths. Purbright had learned long ago that the river seldom lied, but it frequently edited. As they passed the station and turned onto Market Lane, a woman hurried toward them with the determined gait of someone who believed the world owed her explanations. She was short, round-shouldered, and wrapped in a shawl of deep red wool, rich, new, and unmistakably similar to the one found in Pike's shed. "Inspector Purbright?" she demanded before he could greet her. Purbright inclined his head politely. "Yes, madam." "I was told you wished to ask after my shawl." Love blinked. "Your shawl?" She whipped the wool garment from her shoulders and shook it out with theatrical indignation. "Yes, this shawl, the one people keep whispering about, the one I supposedly wore on that boat." "Utter nonsense." Purbright's expression remained serene. "May I ask your name?" "Mrs. Helen Rudge, and before you ask, yes, I own several shawls, but this one is mine. It was stolen off my washing line 2 nights ago. My neighbour swore she saw a figure take it, but she didn't bother to mention that to me until yesterday evening." Love exchanged a startled look with Purbright. "So you didn't board the Gypsy Queen?" "Of course not. I've never set foot on any boat except the ferry at Skegness, and that was quite enough excitement. Whoever was seen in my shawl was not me." Purbright studied her calmly. "May I ask where you were on the night the boat arrived?" "Home," she said, with emphasis. "With my sister. Who can confirm it? We were making pickled onions. You are welcome to smell my kitchen if you're desperate for proof." Love suppressed a smile. "And," Mrs. Rudge continued, growing more indignant with each word, "I want it on record that if someone has been parading around stealing shawls and climbing aboard boats at all hours, it is not my doing. I am a respectable woman." Purbright nodded gently. "I do not doubt your respectability, Mrs. Rudge." She puffed up gratefully. "Good, because people in this town have very long memories and very short goodwill." She bundled her shawl around herself and marched off, leaving a faint scent of vinegar and certainty behind her. Love scratched his head. "Sir, that means the woman Mrs. Birkett saw wasn't her, but she was wearing that shawl." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Which raises the question, why would someone borrow a garment they had no right to?" They resumed walking toward the river, where the Gypsy Queen sat with its usual patient silence. The red shawl found in Pike's shed now took on a different significance, not the garment of the mysterious visitor, but another piece in a mosaic someone seemed determined to break apart and rearrange. Purbright stepped aboard once more, his gaze drawn again to the metal hook near the cabin door. Something had hung from it, perhaps recently. Shawls were too soft to leave marks, but a bag or another garment might have. Love stood beside him, thoughtful for once. So, someone came onto this boat wearing Mrs. Rudge's shawl, not her, someone else. Perhaps someone who wished to look like her from a distance. Purbright said. "But why her? Why not steal a coat or a hat?" Purbright's eyes drifted toward Mrs. Birkett's cottage window, where a figure's silhouette hovered with the telltale stillness of eavesdropping curiosity. "Because, love," he said softly, "a shawl has a shape, a silhouette. At night, in dim light, one figure can resemble another if wrapped correctly." Love considered this. So someone wanted to be mistaken for Mrs. Rudge, or wanted someone else to believe they had seen a woman fitting that description, Purbright corrected. Flaxborough has a fondness for misremembering. They continued examining the boat, but nothing new revealed itself. The Gypsy Queen held its silence as stubbornly as Pike held his charm. When they stepped onto the towpath, a familiar voice hailed them. Mr. Gilby sat on his usual bench, holding the faded performer's poster across his knees. His eyes were distant, as if the past had pulled up a seat beside him. "Inspector," he said, "I remembered something else about the Queen." Purbright approached with quiet interest. "She had a girl with her once," Gilby said. "A helper. Young, nervous thing. Wore shawls all the time, borrowed them, traded them, lost them. I recall she disappeared too. The Queen claimed she'd run off with a fellow, but—" He trailed off, squinting at the water. "Whoever wore that shawl last night was careful, moving quick, not wanting to be noticed, yet wanting to be seen by the right eyes." Love inhaled sharply. "So you think this is connected to the old troupe?" Gilby shrugged. "Memories circle back, especially on rivers." Purbright thanked him, though it was clear he was already fitting this new piece into place. They left the bench and walked along the towpath as the wind stirred the reeds into soft applause. After several minutes of silence, Love asked, "Sir, what does all this mean? Someone pretending to be Mrs. Rudge, using her shawl on the boat, and then a second shawl turning up in Pike's shed?" "It means," Purbright murmured, "that the truth has become heavily costumed." Love frowned. "Costumed, sir?" "Yes," Purbright said, stopping to gaze at the Gypsy Queen. "We are not looking for a vanished woman wearing a red shawl. We are looking for a person who wished to appear as a woman wearing a red shawl, and perhaps another who wished someone else to think she had vanished." Love shivered. "Like someone staging a disappearance." "Or rearranging one," Purbright replied. The river rippled gently against the hull, as if in agreement. "Come, Love," he said at last, turning toward town. "The person who borrowed Mrs. Rudge's shawl has made a mistake." "What mistake, sir?" Purbright gave him a small, patient smile. "They assumed everyone in Flaxborough would recognize the shawl. They forgot the town would never agree on the same description." Love blinked. "So? That helps us?" "It helps us enormously," Purbright said, already walking away. "Because someone wanted to be seen clearly, and instead they have become increasingly visible." They followed the towpath back toward the heart of town, the fading afternoon light stirring the feathers on the Gypsy Queen, as though the boat itself were listening and waiting for what Purbright would uncover next. Purbright began the next morning, not at the river nor at the station, but walking a slow and seemingly aimless circuit through the quieter streets of Flaxborough. Love followed at a respectful distance, unsure whether the inspector was pursuing a lead or simply indulging in an unusually philosophical stroll. With Purbright, the distinction was often indistinguishable. The town was only just beginning to wake. A milk cart rattled down the lane, its bottles clinking with the gentle optimism of routine. A baker's boy hurried past with a tray of loaves, leaving behind a trail of warm fragrance. None of these small disturbances escaped Purbright's attention. He absorbed them all with the mild satisfaction of a man who trusted the town to reveal itself at its own pace. "Sir," Love ventured at last, "shouldn't we be checking the riverbanks again?" In due time, Purbright replied. The river has said what it wished to for the moment. Today we listen to people. Love nodded, though he wasn't sure which people needed listening to. Purbright's first stop was Pike's boatyard. Mr. Pike, immaculate as ever, was leaning against a stack of crates, rehearsing an air of casual industry. His smile brightened with unconvincing spontaneity when he spotted the inspector. Back again, are we? Must be a busy time for you, Purbright. Purbright's own smile was polite, but uncommitted. Mr. Pike, I wondered if you might clarify something. A shawl was found in your shed, rather distinctive one. Yes, Pike said quickly, too quickly. Old lost property. People forget things. People, Purbright repeated mildly. Forget. He let the word drift between them before continuing. Tell me, do you often store lost property in locked sheds? Pike hesitated only half a breath, but the silence was enough for Purbright to file away. It's safer that way, Pike said. Strangers wander about. Wouldn't want thieves. Purbright nodded graciously, thanked him, and made no accusation. Pike seemed thrown off balance by the absence of confrontation, as though he had prepared an entire defence that now had nowhere to go. Love looked confused as they walked away, but Purbright did not explain. Instead, he headed toward the reed beds where the second boat had run aground. There they found the fisherman who had first sounded the alarm, sitting on an upturned bucket and regarding the water with the suspicion of one who expected it to misbehave again. Morning, Inspector, the man grumbled. You here for the lantern business? Lantern business? Love echoed, startled. The fisherman nodded. Saw it again last night. Flicker from the reeds. Someone trying to signal, I reckon. Purbright sat on the edge of the bank, gazing across the water. Tell me, did the light move, or did it remain in one place? Stayed put, the man said, but it pulsed like someone lifting and lowering a shutter. Purbright nodded thoughtfully. And you saw no figure? No, sir. Too dark. The inspector thanked him, but instead of lingering at the reeds, he continued his walk, this time in a looping detour that took them past the post office, the bakery, and finally to the library. Inside, Mr. Gilby was dusting shelves with the ceremonial solemnity of a monk tending relics. Purbright approached him gently. Mr. Gilby, do you recall if the Gypsy Queen, the original performer, ever had dealings with the council or with Mr. Pike? Gilby paused his dusting, his eyes narrowing at some memory just out of reach. Not officially, but there was talk she approached Pike once. Needed a safe berth, I think. He turned her away. Said she made the wrong sort of impression. Did she take offence? Gilby snorted lightly. Only in private. She was proud, that one. Would have rather sunk her boat than begged twice. Purbright's eyes softened. And the girl who travelled with her? Gilby resumed dusting. Never knew her name. Quiet. Watched everything, like she was waiting for someone else's decision. Did she disappear before or after the accusation? Purbright asked. After, Gilby said. But that doesn't mean anything sinister. Performers come and go. Purbright thanked him and stepped back out into the street, where Love immediately hurried to catch up. Sir, Love said, pardon me, but this feels like walking in circles. It is, Purbright said pleasantly. Circles allow one to see things from angles not available in straight lines. Love considered this, ultimately deciding to accept it. Their next stop was Mrs. Burkett's cottage. She appeared at the door with her usual air of anticipation, clearly hoping to contribute again to the investigation. Inspector, have you discovered where the woman went? Not yet, Purbright said, but I wondered if you might recall something. The night you saw the shawled woman speaking to a man, was she carrying anything? Mrs. Birkett frowned. Well, now that you mention it, she might have had a small bag, cloth, I think, hanging from her wrist. I assumed it held cosmetics. Did the man carry anything? A lantern, she said quickly. Folded, the sort that opens like a concertina. Ah, Purbright murmured. A shuttered lantern. Mrs. Birkett beamed, delighted by her own accuracy. You see, Inspector, I notice things. Indeed you do, Purbright said warmly. Once outside, Love whispered. So the lantern the fisherman saw, same type? Likely, Purbright replied. And not used for signalling distress, used for signalling privacy. Love blinked. Privacy, sir? A lantern that opens and closes quietly allows one person to indicate presence to another without drawing attention. So, Love said cautiously, someone in the reeds was waiting for someone else. Or assuring someone they were not alone, Purbright said gently. They walked on until the river came into view again, winding calmly through the heart of the town. Purbright paused at the bridge, looking down at the water with the patience of a man reading an old diary whose pages rearranged themselves overnight. Love leaned on the railing beside him. Sir, are you any closer? Purbright's eyes glimmered with that specific calm that meant he was far closer than he intended to admit. Love, he said softly, what happens when two stories overlap? When one tries to hide beneath the other? Love frowned. Confusion, sir? Exactly, Purbright said. And confusion is never accidental in a town this small. He clasped his hands behind him and resumed walking. Come, Love, we have one more conversation to arrange, and it must be timed with care. They moved along the river path, the water keeping quiet pace beside them, waiting for the moment when Purbright chose to break its silence. The evening settled over Flaxborough with a kind of uneasy politeness, as though the town itself sensed Purbright was nearing a conclusion and wished to avoid intruding. Lamps flickered to life along the riverside path, each tiny globe of light trembling faintly in the breeze. Love walked beside the inspector, alert but uncertain, aware that Purbright was moving with the calm purpose of a man arranging pieces for a conversation that would matter more than any interrogation. Sir, Love said quietly, you mentioned we needed one more conversation. With whom? Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he paused on the towpath, listening to the river as though weighing its opinion. With those who have already spoken too much, he said at last, and with one who has spoken barely at all. Love blinked. Which one is that? Purbright resumed walking. You will see. They approached the boatyard first. Pike was inside the office, visible through the window as he fussed with a ledger, one that looked suspiciously like the green-bound volume they had inspected the day before. Purbright knocked gently on the glass. Pike's expression, when he turned, was one of forced warmth, stretched thin over anxiety. "Inspector!" Pike exclaimed as he opened the door. "Evening stroll?" "Of a sort," Purbright replied. "I wondered if you might spare a moment." Pike hesitated but stepped aside, smoothing his hair with unnecessary precision. "Of course. Anything for the investigation." The ledger lay open on the desk, its pages filled with Pike's cramped handwriting. Purbright's eyes drifted toward it without accusation. "You keep careful records." "Essential," Pike said quickly. "One must keep track of moorings, rentals, maintenance." "And memories?" Purbright asked mildly. Pike jolted. "Memories?" Purbright touched the corner of the open page. "A fascinating quality of ledgers. They remember only what the writer chooses to record. But when a page goes missing, the absence can be eloquent." Pike swallowed. I don't know what you mean." Purbright offered a gentle smile. "I suspect you do, and I suspect someone else knew it too." Before Pike could respond, a soft flicker of light pulsed through the window, subtle, distant, unmistakable. Love turned sharply toward the river. "Sir, the—"
"Lantern, the one reported in the reeds." Purbright nodded once. "Right on time." He thanked Pike with impeccable courtesy and stepped outside. Pike lingered in the doorway, visibly torn between following and pretending he had other tasks. Purbright offered him no guidance. "Come, love," he said, already moving toward the path. "We must see who is speaking tonight." The flicker came again, once, twice, then vanished. Love hurried ahead, boots thudding on the towpath, but Purbright slowed as they reached the curve of reeds beside the old moorings. The river here was almost completely hidden by tall rushes, their dry stalks rustling like pages being turned. Love scanned the shadows frantically. "Sir, I don't see anyone." "You won't," Purbright said, "not unless they wish to be seen." He moved forward with gentle patience. The reeds parted slightly as he approached, not with the violent snap of someone pushing through, but with the careful fold of someone who had been waiting. A thin, pale-faced man stepped into view. His coat was worn, his hair unkempt, and in his hand he held a small, shuttered lantern, the concertina kind described by Mrs. Birkett. He looked at Purbright with the exhausted resignation of someone whose secret had finally tired of being hidden. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I wondered how long it would take you." Love stared. "Sir, who—" Purbright answered without taking his eyes off the man. "Mr. Frayne, former lockkeeper, traveller of the waterways, and I believe former assistant to the woman known as the Gypsy Queen." Frayne gave a weak smile. "She just called me her shadow." Love's mouth fell open. "But she disappeared years ago." "Yes," Frayne said, "and because the town made it impossible for her to stay. Rumours, accusations, you know how it goes." Purbright nodded sympathetically. "And you return now. For what reason?" Frayne looked down at the lantern in his hands. "She died last winter, quietly, without fuss. But before she went, she told me to bring her things back here. To the river she loved, even though it had turned against her." Love's voice softened. "Things, sir? What things?" Frayne reached into his coat and pulled out a cloth-wrapped object. He unwrapped it slowly. A small, leather-bound book. Not a diary this time, but a ledger. Not Pike's. Purbright took it gently. The cover was decorated with hand-painted patterns, faded but beautiful. Inside were pages of notes, lists of performances, sketches of costumes, names of people the Queen had met, both kind and cruel. Among the entries, one appeared often. Olwyn Pike. "Pike," Love whispered. "Sir, this ledger—" "That is the Queen's," Purbright finished. "A record of her travels, and of those who helped her, or refused her help, along the way." Frayne exhaled shakily. "She told me to deliver it to her girl. I thought she was dead, or lost, but—"
"When I heard about the Gypsy Queen arriving here, I hoped she'd come back with it." Love shook his head. "The girl? But who—" Purbright's voice cut in gently. "The girl grew up, love, changed her name, married, bought shawls for washing lines. Mrs. Rudge is not simply an offended housewife. She was that girl. The Queen protected her from scandal years ago." Love whispered. "But Mrs. Rudge said she never saw the boat." "She didn't," Purbright said. "Someone else wore her shawl to mislead the town. Someone who feared what this ledger would reveal. Someone whose name appears in it more often than he wished." Love stared back down the path toward Pike's boatyard. "Pike," Frayne nodded. "He turned the Queen away once and blamed her for things she never did. He couldn't let her ledger show that." Purbright closed the book with a soft sound. And so he tore out a page, placed it somewhere confusing, hid a shawl, spread just enough disorder to make the river appear guilty instead of himself. The reeds rustled in agreement. Love swallowed. "Sir, what now?" Purbright's voice was calm, almost kind. Now we let Mr. Pike explain himself, in a well-lit civil room where lanterns cannot hide the truth. Frayne handed over the lantern. "I'm tired of secrets, Inspector." Purbright placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then you shall have no more." They emerged from the reeds, the river's quiet sigh following them. Ahead, the lights of the town flickered like watchful eyes. "Come, love," Purbright said softly. "Tomorrow the river will speak plainly, and so will we." Morning arrived with a clear, rinsed light, as though the river had spent the night washing its conscience. Purbright walked toward the station at an unhurried pace, carrying the Queen's ledger tucked neatly beneath his arm. Love walked beside him with the tense solemnity of a man who sensed an end approaching, but could not yet picture its shape. Mr. Frayne waited at the station door, hat in hand, looking far less like a conspirator than a man who had misplaced several years and finally found them again. Purbright greeted him warmly before ushering everyone inside. Pike had already been asked to attend and arrived moments later wearing an expression of forced hospitality that crumpled slightly when he saw Frayne. "Inspector," Pike said, attempting levity, "must we hold these meetings at such an early hour?" Purbright gestured to a chair. "Please, Mr. Pike, we won't trouble you long." Pike sat, smoothing invisible wrinkles from his trousers, eyes darting from Frayne to the ledger on the desk. Love stood quietly by the window, watching him with a steadiness Pike found deeply unnerving. Purbright opened the ledger and turned it toward Pike. "I believe you know this book." Pike's jaw tightened. "I know nothing of it." "A pity," Purbright murmured. "It contains a good deal about—"
"You." Frayne's voice broke the fragile silence. "You remember her, Pike, the Queen. You turned her away when she needed help. Said she made a poor impression on your business." Pike flushed. "It was nothing personal. The council was breathing down my neck about outsiders." Purbright leafed calmly through the pages. "She recorded that you refused her mooring for fear of scandal, that you preferred the river to seem orderly, even if it meant letting someone drift away in need." "That was years ago," Pike snapped. "Ancient history." "History," Purbright said gently, "does not become less true simply by aging." He stopped on a torn page, the absence more eloquent than any written accusation. "You removed this sheet. Why?" Pike swallowed, then exhaled sharply. "It mentioned an argument. I didn't want misunderstandings." Purbright nodded. "She confronted you, I believe. Asked why you had spread certain stories after the theft incident." "She thought I'd blamed her," Pike protested. "But I didn't. I only... Look, the town was panicking. People wanted someone responsible. She was unconventional." "Unconventional," Frayne echoed bitterly. "She was kind. She took me in when no one else would. You let her reputation drown to keep your own afloat." Pike's voice tightened. "It wasn't like that." Love cleared his throat. "Sir, the second boat, the torn page, was that Pike as well?" Purbright shook his head slightly. "No, Mr. Pike is many things, but subtle is not one of them. His interference was clumsy, a hidden shawl, a missing page. Someone else brought in the second boat." Frayne lifted his chin. "Me. I guided it upriver at night. I thought her girl would be on the Gypsy Queen. Thought she'd come back for her mother's things. I thought she might need a sign." Purbright turned to Pike. "Mr. Frayne wished only to deliver memories. You wished to bury them." Pike clenched his fists. "So what now? Am I to be charged with, what, untidiness? An old lie?" Purbright's expression remained mild. No crime has been committed, but the truth deserves a hearing. He closed the ledger with a quiet finality. The woman seen on the river, wearing Mrs. Rudge's shawl, was not a ghost of the past, nor a criminal. She was a local girl helping Mr. Frayne. She wore the shawl because she thought its bright colour would draw attention to the boat, not conceal it. She misunderstood whom she was trying to signal. The clumsy performance created only confusion. Love blinked. "Who was she, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Mr. Frayne's niece, helping return what her uncle felt belonged here." Pike sagged in his chair, relief and embarrassment wrestling for dominance. "So, all this chaos was over a book of old stories." Purbright folded his hands behind his back. Old stories are often the ones most needing to be heard, especially when they
Was silenced the first time. There was no triumph in his tone, only quiet certainty. Frayne exhaled shakily. "She wanted her girl to have it, Mrs. Rudge, but I couldn't bring myself to knock on her door, thought she'd hate me for letting her mother leave." Purbright shook his head. "Mrs. Rudge remembers her mother differently than this town did. She will accept the ledger, not with bitterness, but gratitude." Pike ran a hand through his hair. "And me?" Purbright regarded him with the steady gaze that could either comfort or dismantle. "Mr. Pike, you may continue being a model citizen if you wish, but I advise you to be a kinder one. Reputations, like rivers, flow in both directions." Pike said nothing more. When the meeting ended, Frayne walked with Purbright and Love toward the river. The morning sun cast warm ripples across the water, gilding the edges of the Gypsy Queen where it rested with a serene finality. Frayne paused. She would have liked this, coming home quietly, no fuss. Purbright nodded. She returned in the only way she ever travelled, unexpectedly but with purpose. Love looked at the ledger in Purbright's hand. "Sir, what happens now?" "Now," Purbright said softly, "Mrs. Rudge receives what was intended for her, and we allow the river to settle." They walked toward the row of cottages. Mrs. Rudge stood outside her door, arms folded, as though halfway expecting them. When Purbright approached, she frowned. "Inspector, what's this about now?" Purbright offered her the ledger. She took it, bewildered, opening the cover just enough to see the painted patterns. Recognition flickered across her face, slow, spreading, unmistakably tender. "My mother's," she whispered. Purbright bowed his head slightly. "Delivered by someone who never forgot her." Mrs. Rudge pressed the ledger to her chest, tears gathering but refusing to fall. "Thank you," she managed, before retreating inside, closing the door gently behind her. Purbright turned back toward the river, the reeds bent in the breeze as though offering a final, weary bow. Love exhaled. "Sir, it's all finished then?" "For now," Purbright said. "Flaxborough rarely stays quiet for long." They stood a moment longer, listening to the soft lap of water against wood. Then Purbright adjusted his coat, nodded once to the river, and began the calm walk back toward the station, where paperwork awaited with its usual, dependable lack of mystery. And so the town, with all its gossip, its memories, its private wounds, folded the incident into its archives, making room for the next small disturbance that would surely come. The end